Iran just made a critical mistake that may in fact end the entire existence of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. This Iranian regime might have just shot itself in the foot. Allow me to explain. Well, you see, the October 7th attacks on Israel, they were a huge embarrassment to the Israelis. Massive failure, operational military intelligence, no doubt. But they were also a huge con that was played on the general public around the world. You see, the reports that came out on mainstream media about what happened on October 7th range from one version, which is, well, it's a bunch of crazies from Gaza that did all these unspeakable things to the Israelis. All the way to, yes, but the Israelis kind of deserve this. Nobody came out and gave you the full geopolitical picture, the big picture of what actually is going on here. Because while Hamas actually did this, it was just a subcontractor and a pawn in a much larger game of chess. Now, in order to understand this game of chess, you have to understand this new world that's being formed right now in front of our eyes. You just have to stop listening to mainstream media to understand exactly what's going on. You see, Russia's invasion to Ukraine was step one, kind of the symbolic ending to the previous world order that we had for the 80 years, starting with the end of the Second World War. A world order which ensured access to resources to everybody based on this huge globalization platform that was policed by the United States, the UN, the IMF, and so forth. Now, that arrangement, that globalization arrangement, is dead. And Russia is one of the first countries to figure that out. And when they pushed to Ukraine, they didn't do that because it was NATO expansionism. It wasn't because they were out there to protect Russian people in the eastern side of Ukraine, which were living there for 30 years, and nobody gave a damn about these people. It has done so because this deglobalization process requires new alliances, new enemies, new arrangements, and new moves to ensure influence and protection. This whole new process of deglobalization means that resources are not going to be as available to everyone at all the same time. It's not going to be just about paying for something and getting it. That whole thing is dead. So that's why we have a new axis being formed to create this new alliance to basically secure their position against the United States and the West. And what happened in Ukraine wasn't about NATO expansionism. That's just Russian propaganda. They've paid some people to tell you about. It's not about protecting the Russian people in eastern Ukraine, which were living there for the past 30 years and nobody thought about protecting them before. It's about resources. Ukraine is number 7 in the world in iron extraction, number 6 in titanium. It's the second biggest gas reserve in Europe after Russia. It has massive lithium fields, and it has massive wheat and corn supplies. And all of them are in the eastern part of the country, the one that Putin took. There's a reason Putin didn't conquer the west or the center of Ukraine. He took the resources. That was all he needed. Now, China's move on Taiwan is predicated on the same factors, if you think about it. It's not about Chinese nationalism. Come on. It's just a bunch of hooey propaganda. It's about resources. 60% of the global semiconductor supply comes from Taiwan, from TSMC. The Chinese want it. The world as we know it today is built on semiconductors. Every single thing in your house needs semiconductors. Chinese want to own 60% of it. There's a lot of plays going on right now showing you what's actually going on here, despite this beautiful sing kumbaya around the campfire stories they're telling you on mainstream media. And what happened in October 7th in Israel is the third member of that alliance, Russia, China, Iran, making its move. Now you have Taiwan, you have Ukraine, and now you have the Middle East. And boy, it might be the most complicated of them all. The IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, it's not a democracy, but there's a lot of non-democratic regimes in the world that are popular, like the UAE, extremely popular, like the Saudis, they have an extremely popular monarchy. Now the IRGC is not popular. Most people in Iran hate the IRGC. And if you know something about history, for non-democratic regimes to survive, they either need for the street to like the king, which is not the case in Iran, or they need to rule them by a huge amount of force and deterrence. And that is not easy when you have a lot of ethnic division in Iran, a lot of ethnic tensions, and I spoke about it in another video. When you have really poor socioeconomic state because of all the sanctions, the economy is in the toilet, not to mention the fact that the IRGC are horrible at policy making from an economic standpoint. And on top of it, you see like the bombings in Iran, the ISIS stuff that's going on in Iran, showing you there's a lot of mess going on. The IRGC is a highly unpopular dictatorship, which makes it very vulnerable eventually at some point. And I understand that. Because once a regime that's anti-US is unpopular and it has poor, really angry people, this is where the United States comes in with their Arab Spring and the color revolutions and whatnot, and they push these guys out of power and they replace them with somebody more US friendly, which is the huge fear of Iran. Because the IRGC has one goal, and one goal alone. And the single goal of the IRGC is to remain in power at all costs. And now that is at risk. Their solution to this problem is very simple. Let's reach nuclear bomb status. Once we hit that, we are untouchable. The United States and the West will not meddle in our business if we have a nuke. Look at North Korea. Very, very simple. We want the same thing. Also, we need to generate a common enemy for the people on the street to hate. Simple. Israel, check. We need to override the sanctions from the West and sell our massive amounts of oil and energy to get some money into our economy. Trade with China, sell them cheap oil. Check. Over the past 3 years, the Chinese-Iranian oil trade have tripled. What about a defense alliance? We need protection. Well, let's team up with Russia and China. And also, if we become the boss of the Middle East, we get to prevent a lot of these processes against us before they happen, if we own the influence in the region. So for that, we have to push the Saudi Arabians from this role and take over. So this became the Iranian plan years ago. Now, the United States, for the past few years, have been going through a change of their own, basically saying, look, we want out of the Middle East, but we still want to control it and maintain influence over it. We have bigger fish to fry, Ukraine, Taiwan. Also, we're not that interested in global politics anymore because, as I just explained, the old world order is dying. We no longer need to be the world's policeman. Plus, we already are a net exporter of energy, so we're not that interested to physically be present in the Middle East. But how do we maintain power and influence over that region remotely? Well, let's find some people who are not very friendly with Iran. The three countries that are terrified from the Iranian nuke the most is Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Let's bond them together in one regional alliance agreement. We'll call it the Abraham Accords. And once they actually sign normalization agreements with the Israelis, the rest of the Arab world will follow the Saudis, as they always do, and then Iran will be isolated. And also, we'll build an economic corridor from India to Saudi Arabia to Israel to Greece, basically cutting Iran out of the energy trade in the world, which would absolutely isolate Iran, both economically and politically and militarily. On top of it, we may work out some sort of a deal of a Middle East air defense alliance, much like NATO, but just in the Middle East with the Israelis, the Saudis, and the UAE. And that's going to allow us to keep a tab on that region. Of course, we'll have to arm the Saudis to the teeth and the Israelis to the teeth, of course. But we're going to be able to control that region and isolate Iran and topple the IRGC without physically being there. And of course, you have the Iranians looking at this and saying, oh my God, we're about to get reamed. We're going to be the biggest loser here. We have to stop this. Otherwise, we're going to lose the regime. Now, they initiate a play in which they use the proxy they've kind of farmed for the past 30 years, which is Hamas. But basically, they finance an education system that raised and indoctrinated a bunch of murderous psychopaths that has one goal in life. That's only to kill Israelis and die in the process. They fund them, they train them, they equip them, and they wait until they have to pull that wild card. And they've decided that they came on October 7th, they pulled that card, and they put the Israelis in a bind. Because once they've done what they've done, atrocious things, murdering 1,400 civilians in a single day, and starting firing rockets from the north of Israel, from Hezbollah to the north of Israel, de facto, you have 1,400 dead and a couple of 100,000 of Israelis basically evacuated from the homes in the north and in the south. So the Israelis have no political choice but to go to war in Gaza. I mean, otherwise, these people in power, the Benjamin Netanyahu government, is finished. Also, there's no way for them to put 200, 300,000 people back in their homes while clearing the Gazan threat. And because Hamas is absolutely embedded within the civilian population on purpose, this would mean a huge loss of life on the civilian side, which would deem the Israelis, in the eyes of the Arab world, unacceptable, and that would end the availability of Israel as a partner, potentially, for the Saudis. And the potential bonus might be that the Israelis might have to deal with a lot of angry Arabs that also have citizenship in Israel, which actually never happened, but that's a whole different story. So Iran was the chief operating officer of this operation. The Qataris were the CFO, the chief financial officers. They paid for it. The Iranians equipped and trained. And Hamas was the factory worker who pressed the button like a Homer Simpson, didn't fully understanding that they're ending their own hopes of a peaceful coexistence with the Israelis in order to progress somebody else's interests as just being a pawn. Not the first time the Palestinians were played. The previous time it was by the KGB and the USSR. And now the Iranians are using them as the disposable, single-use, single-patient kind of accessory, unfortunately. Now, initially, there was very little proof that Iran or Qatar had anything to do with this. And while Qatar still managed to keep a plausible deniability approach to this whole thing, the Iranians have just dry snitched on themselves, exposing that they were part of this. And unlike the Qataris, the Iranians don't have the money and the entire Western economic system bought and paid for to shield themselves and bail themselves out in case there's any shenanigans. The Iranians are in deep doo-doo. And the way this mistake happened is kind of interesting. When the war started, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the regime, they knew Hamas was pretty much finished. But they said to themselves, look, we're not going to sacrifice Hezbollah in the north of Israel to help Hamas. No. We want to save Hezbollah as a deterrence against Israel so we can proceed to a nuke. But what we can do is really try and aggravate Israel in different directions to keep their focus not entirely on Gaza. Let's have Hezbollah fire a few rockets. Let's have the Houthi rebels fire a few rockets. And that way we distract the Israelis. We have them deployed on different fronts, which may give a slim chance of survival to Hamas, right? It's a Hail Mary, but what the hell? Why not try it, right? So while Hezbollah firing rockets on Israel isn't anything new, it's not a global issue. Everybody knows Iran is behind it, but it's an Israeli internal issue. They have beef with Hezbollah. Who cares, right? That's kind of the approach of the global street. But when the Houthi rebels go beyond the original plan of firing a few rockets on Israel, some of which, by the way, were shot down by Saudi Arabia. So we had Saudi Arabia shoot down missiles fired by the Houthi rebels to Israel. So the whole Middle Eastern air defense system, it's actually already in place, guys, just in case you need to Google this to make sure that I'm not just bullshitting you. So when the Houthi rebels go beyond firing a few rockets to Israel and they actually blockade the entire Suez Canal, you have 12% of the entire world shipping lanes being blocked by a bunch of people in sandals blocking off a huge global supply chain item. That's a huge global issue. It becomes an issue that everybody all of a sudden care about. And now everybody wants to see what the hell is going on. Why is my shampoo now 20% more expensive? Why is my inflation numbers going up and the people here demand for me to resign if I'm some sort of politician? What's going on here? Why do we have the Suez Canal blocked? And now you have a lot of countries around the world, a lot of influential people adding one and one and getting two. They're looking at this and saying, well, look, the Houthi rebels, they don't have a beef with the Israelis. Not at all. They've never had it. We've never heard about these guys. Why are they blocking the Suez Canal to pressure the Egyptians in a war that has nothing to do with them? Are they that in love with the Palestinians, which they've never had any relationship with? No. The reason is the Houthi rebels are a clear Iranian proxy. They're much more of a proxy than Hezbollah is. They completely have zero independence, and they're just Iranians in a Yemenite rebel disguise. So if the Iranians are doing this, if the Iranians are blockading the Suez Canal to hurt Egypt, so that Egypt does not play with Israel and the US in its war against Gaza and Hamas, that means that Iran is now directly linked to the war in Gaza and to the October 7th attacks. So the whole doctrine of Iran, of the IRGC, is to stay in the shadows. It's the king on the chessboard. It rarely moves. All the pawns can run around. We're going to sit back and let all of you all take care of each other. Finally, they screwed up. Because now, with the Houthi rebels blocking the Suez Canal, the linkage between Iran and the October 7th attacks is there in the open. And by creating that linkage, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard basically put itself as a massive target. Because while Qatari money and owning every single football club, university, you name it, It's going to shield them from any repercussions for what happened on October 7th. This actually means that Iranians are now part of this whole game. They're fair game. That's why you have the United States allowing the Israelis to carry out strikes in Syria, in Lebanon, taking out major Iranian players, which they were not allowed so far for months, for years. That's why I have US attacking Houthi rebels in Yemen, basically bombing the crap out of them. And on top of that, you have the US naval coalition basically owning the Bab el-Mandab, essentially the whole access point to the Suez Canal. And the problem is that once the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, once they have full linkage, once they have been completely implicated in this war, and they have been revealed, they're no longer behind the curtain. They have a huge target on their back. And again, because they don't have Qatari money and Qatari influence, nobody's going to help them. And the United States and the West are coming for them. It's just a question of time. In fact, this is the beginning of the end of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They just don't know it yet. Now look, I've made a whole video explaining why Qatar, despite being a complete accomplice to this whole thing, will probably not get punished. How they've bought an insurance policy, basically saving themselves from the repercussions like Iran. This whole video is right here. Go check it out right now. I'll see you there in a second. If you haven't yet, subscribe right here. If you haven't yet, subscribe to our Patreon. These videos are not fully monetized. We are in a kind of a process of educating people and teaching people what actually is going on. If you want to be a supporter of this channel, help this project, help to support what we're doing here, consider joining Patreon, patreon.com/Tom Nash Report. Would love to see you there as well. We have a few articles, a few videos, but mainly it's for you guys to support what we do here. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one.